Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Muthukutty Chandran, a name that once turned the lush, emerald hills of Kerala into a landscape of waking nightmares. Before we begin, find your most comfortable position. Let the weight of your body sink into the mattress. Breathe in the cool air, and as you exhale, let go of the day. We are traveling back to the mid-80s, to a land where the rain falls in heavy, rhythmic sheets and the air smells of wet earth and ripening fruit. This is a story of a silence that was broken, not by the storm, but by a shadow that moved unseen through the groves. In the northern reaches of Kerala, near the border of Karnataka, the landscape is dominated by the rubber plantations. They are beautiful, orderly, and deeply quiet. Imagine thousands of trees standing in perfect, haunting rows, their silver-gray bark scarred by the diagonal lines of the tapper's knives. Each tree carries a small clay cup, catching the slow, rhythmic drip of white latex, the lifeblood of the forest, appearing like liquid milk in the dim light of dawn. This was the world of the mid-1980s, a time before the noise of the modern world had reached these isolated groves. It was a place where people trusted the silence, where the only sounds were the calls of tropical birds and the occasional rustle of a dry leaf falling to the forest floor. But in 1985, that peace began to fray at the edges, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that would eventually paralyze the entire region. The date was September 10th, 1985. The monsoon rains had begun to retreat, leaving behind a humid, heavy warmth that clung to the skin. In the district of Kasaragod, near a quiet place called Kemnad, the morning started like any other. The sun was a pale orange orb struggling to pierce through the thick canopy of the rubber trees. The tappers were already out, moving like ghosts between the trunks, their sharp tools making soft, clicking sounds against the wood. It is a meditative process, tapping a rubber tree. It requires precision and a deep connection to the rhythm of the grove. But on this particular Tuesday, the rhythm was shattered. A woman named Ramani was found. She was the first, though no one knew then that she was merely the beginning of a long and bloody chapter. She was discovered in a place where she should have been safe, a place where the only thing anyone expected to find was the harvest of the trees. The discovery did not bring immediate chaos. Instead, it brought a profound, heavy silence. The villagers gathered at the edge of the plantation, their eyes wide, their voices reduced to whispers. They looked at the serene landscape, the soft moss, the elegant trees, the damp soil, and they could not reconcile it with the violence that had just occurred. The contrast was too sharp. The white, pristine latex of the trees seemed to mock the dark reality of what had been left behind in the dirt. The initial atmosphere was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. In these small border villages, crime was something that happened elsewhere, in the crowded cities, or in the stories told on the radio. Here, the biggest worries were the price of rubber or the health of the cattle. The police arrived, their olive-green uniforms appearing bright against the deep greens of the grove. They moved slowly, carefully, navigating the slippery terrain of the plantation. They were looking for clues, for footprints in the soft mud, for a struggle, but the grove kept its secrets well. The perpetrator had moved with a terrifying efficiency. There were no witnesses, no loud screams heard over the rustle of the leaves. It was as if the forest itself had opened up and swallowed the peace of the community. As the investigators worked, the villagers stood back, watching the shadows of the trees lengthen as the day progressed. Every movement of a branch, every snap of a twig, began to feel like a threat. The rubber grove, once a source of livelihood and comfort, had transformed into a labyrinth of potential hiding places. The silence of the grove was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, and haunting. They began to wonder who could have done such a thing. Was it a stranger passing through from across the border? Or was it someone they knew, someone who walked among them during the day and waited in the darkness of the trees at night? As news of the discovery spread from Kemnad to the surrounding hamlets, A collective shiver ran through the district. People began to lock their doors earlier. The unsecured houses, those simple structures of brick and thatch located near the edges of the plantations or close to the lonely railway tracks, felt suddenly vulnerable. The architecture of the region, designed for ventilation and community, now seemed like a series of open invitations to a predator. You could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the windows, a sound that used to be a lullaby but was now a source of sharp, sudden anxiety. The investigators noted the method, a brutal, heavy blow to the head. It was a primitive kind of violence, one that required immense strength and a chilling lack of empathy. They didn't have a name for the killer yet. They didn't know about Muthukutty Chandran. They didn't know that he was a man who had left his home at the age of 14, a man who had lived a shadow life of theft and wandering across the border in Karnataka. All they knew was that the grove was quiet and that a woman was gone. The pickaxe and the hammer had not yet become the symbols of terror they would soon be. In these early days, it was just a single, tragic event that everyone hoped was an isolated incident. But the shadows in the rubber trees were growing longer, and the man who called himself the Ripper was only just beginning his work. Close your eyes now and imagine that plantation as the sun begins to set. The heat of the day is fading, replaced by a cool, damp mist that rises from the floor of the grove. The rows of trees become indistinguishable from one another, a sea of gray and black. The clay cups on the trunks look like small, pale faces watching from the dark. In the distance, you might hear the low rumble of a train on the tracks that cut through the landscape, a reminder of the world outside. But here, inside the grove, time seems to stand still. This is the silence of the grove, a silence that holds the memory of that first discovery in 1985. It is a silence that would eventually be filled with the names of 14 victims, but for now, it is just a heavy, thick layer of mystery. The air is still. The leaves are motionless. As we move deeper into the story of Muthukutty Chandran, remember this landscape. Remember the smell of the rubber and the dampness of the Kerala earth. It was here, in the most serene of places, that a monster found his hunting ground. The journey is long, and the path is dark, but for now, let the image of the quiet grove fade. You are safe in the present, away from the shadows of the past. Let your breathing slow down. Listen to the rhythm of the rain in your mind, and prepare yourself for the long night ahead. The story of the man they would call Ripper Chandran has only just begun to unfold, and the silence is about to become much deeper. The morning air in the borderlands between Kerala and Karnataka is often heavy with a specific kind of silence. It is a silence born of the dense foliage and the way the rolling hills cradle the sound of the wind. But in the early months of 1985, that silence began to feel different. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of the rural life. It was a silence that felt loaded, as if the very trees were holding their breath. The discovery of the first victim, a woman named Ramani in the Kasaragod district, had already sent a ripple of unease through the local communities. She had been found in a state that defied the usual logic of local crimes. But it was the second occurrence, emerging through the damp morning fog, that truly began to weave a chilling pattern into the mist. Imagine a small, modest home tucked away near the railway lines in Manjaswaram. The sun had not yet burned off the gray haze of the night, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic clatter of a passing train. Neighbors began to stir as the light improved, but the house remained unnaturally still. There was no smoke rising from the kitchen fire, no sound of water being drawn from the well. When a neighbor finally approached the door, they found it slightly ajar, swinging gently on its hinges with a soft, mournful creak. Inside, the air was heavy and metallic. As the investigators stepped into the dim interior, they were met with a scene that would haunt their sleep for decades. Not one, but 3 members of the same family lay where they had fallen. The violence had been sudden and absolute. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture to suggest a fight for life. It was as if death had arrived on silent feet while the household was still lost in the depths of slumber. The mist outside seemed to press against the windows, a silent witness to the carnage within. As the police began their grim work, they noticed the specific nature of the wounds. Each victim had been struck with a heavy, blunt object, directed with terrifying precision at the head. The force used was immense, far beyond what would be necessary to merely subdue someone. It was a signature of raw, unchecked brutality. They looked for the weapon, but it was gone, taken by the shadow that had vanished back into the hills. In the corner of the room, a pickaxe leaned against the wall, but it was clean. The investigators realized the killer brought his own tools of destruction. They began to look at the bodies more closely, searching for a motive in the wreckage of the home. It didn't take long for the officers to realize that, while the lives of the family had been taken with such disregard, their most humble earthly treasures had been meticulously sought out. The gold was missing. In these rural communities, gold is more than just jewelry. It is a family's security, often worn daily by the women of the house. The investigators found that the heavy gold earrings had been torn from the ears of the victims, leaving behind jagged wounds that told a story of frantic greed. Bangles were gone, and necklaces had been unclasped or broken away. The cold calculation required to systematically strip the dead of their ornaments, moments after committing such a violent act, suggested a predator with a heart as cold as the mountain stone. This was the exact same detail they had noted in the case of Ramani just 1 month prior. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. 2 locations, miles apart, yet the method was identical. The target was always the same: unsecured homes, often those near the transportation arteries of the highway or the rail. And always, the focus was on the most vulnerable within. The local authorities began to talk in hushed tones about the pattern. They spoke of a shadow that moved through the mist, a man who knew the terrain well enough to vanish before the alarm could ever be raised. The term Ripper began to circulate among the villagers, a name borrowed from the dark lore of history to describe the sheer mechanical coldness of the killings. They realized this wasn't a crime of passion or a local dispute. This was the work of a man who viewed people as obstacles between him and the gold they wore. The investigation shifted from a search for a local thief to the hunt for a serial predator. The mist that the villagers once found beautiful now felt like a shroud, a place where Muthukutty Chandran could hide in plain sight, watching and waiting for the next light to go out in a lonely window. As news of the Manjaswaram tragedy spread, a collective fear gripped the border districts. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted with heavy iron bars. Families began to sleep in shifts, terrified of the silence of the night. The police struggled to find a lead, as the killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no mercy. All they had was the pattern, the hammer-like blows, the missing gold, and the proximity to the tracks. It was a signature written in blood across the landscape. They knew that as long as the mist continued to roll in from the hills, the man they would eventually know as Chandran was still out there, moving through the shadows, searching for another unsecured door and another soul to vanish into the dark. The pattern was set, and the terror was only just beginning to take hold of the high ranges. The air in Nayatinkara was thick with more than just the usual humid embrace of the tropical evening. It was heavy, with a silence that had begun to settle over the homes like a shroud. Usually, this time of day was filled with the rhythmic sounds of domestic life. The clinking of metal pots being washed at the well, the distant calling of mothers to their children playing in the dust, and the steady, comforting hum of the evening prayer from the local temples. But now, as the sun dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the coconut palms, the sounds were different. They were sharper, more guarded. The wooden shutters of the small houses were pulled closed much earlier than they used to be, the heavy timber groaning against the frames as if protesting the sudden isolation. Inside, families sat in the dim glow of kerosene lamps, their conversations reduced to low, frantic murmurs. Every rustle of a dry leaf in the garden, every snap of a twig from the nearby rubber plantation, caused hearts to skip a beat. The village was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a landscape of shadows, where every tree seemed to conceal a waiting threat. The fear was most acute among the women of the district. For generations, the gold they wore, the delicate chains passed down through families, the heavy earrings and the intricate bangles, had been a symbol of security and tradition. But now, that same gold felt like a weight around their necks, a shimmering target that might draw the attention of the man who moved through the night. They spoke of him in hushed tones as they gathered water during the day, their eyes constantly scanning the dense green undergrowth that pressed against the narrow village paths. They had heard the stories from Manjaswaram, stories of a predator who did not just steal, but who left behind a trail of broken lives and silent rooms. They imagined him as a specter, a figure born from the darkness itself, capable of sliding through the smallest gaps in a doorway. Many began to hide their jewelry in the earth or beneath the floorboards, preferring to feel the bareness of their skin rather than the cold, dangerous glint of gold in the moonlight. In the local tea stalls, the usual political debates had been replaced by a singular, grim preoccupation. The men sat with their glasses of steaming chai, trading fragments of rumors like currency. Some said the killer was a man from the forest, someone who knew the terrain better than the local guides. Others whispered that he was a traveler, a worker who had drifted into the area under the guise of looking for employment, only to watch and wait for the perfect moment of vulnerability. They spoke of the Ripper, a name that had begun to travel from the newspapers into the very heart of their community. It was a name that carried the weight of a hammer blow, a name that suggested a calculated, cold-blooded efficiency. The rumors grew more elaborate with every telling. Some claimed he could see in total darkness with the eyes of a cat, while others believed he was protected by dark spirits that allowed him to walk through walls. These stories did more than just frighten. They paralyzed the village, turning every stranger into a suspect and every neighbor into a source of doubt. The local authorities in Nayatinkara found themselves caught in a storm they were ill-prepared to weather. The police station, a modest building with peeling paint and stacks of dusty ledgers, became the center of a desperate, flailing investigation. The officers were used to settling land disputes or dealing with petty thefts, not hunting a phantom who left no fingerprints and no witnesses. They organized night patrols, the beams of their weak flashlights cutting pathetic swaths through the encroaching fog that rolled in from the coast. They walked the winding paths that skirted the railway lines, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel, but the killer always seemed to be one step ahead. He knew the rhythms of the village better than they did. He knew when the patrols would be at the north end of the district, leaving the southern homes exposed. The investigators combed through the tall grass near the highways, looking for a discarded tool or a scrap of fabric, but the earth yielded nothing but more questions and the persistent smell of damp soil. Frustration turned into a quiet, simmering desperation within the ranks of the law. They questioned the local laborers, the drifters, and the men who slept on the benches of the railway platforms, but no one fit the profile of the monster they were looking for. There was no modern forensic laboratory to analyze the scenes, and no digital database to track the movements of a career criminal. They relied on their instincts and the testimony of the terrified, which was often clouded by the fog of trauma and the distortions of the dark. Every lead they followed seemed to vanish into the humid air of the plantations. The more they searched, the more the village felt like a maze with no exit, a place where the predator was not an outsider, but a presence that had become part of the very atmosphere. The officers felt the eyes of the community on them, demanding answers they did not have, while they themselves felt the chilling sensation of being watched from the tree line by someone who knew their every move. As the weeks stretched on, the psychological toll on the community deepened. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. Men took turns staying awake, sitting on their porches with thick wooden staves, their eyes straining to pierce the blackness that pressed in from all sides. The vibrant life of the village had been replaced by a state of siege. They watched the moon wax and wane, fearing the nights when the light was dim and the shadows were longest. They were waiting for a mistake, waiting for a sign, or perhaps just waiting for the inevitable moment when the whispers would turn back into screams. The predator remained unseen, a silent force lurking just beyond the reach of the lamplight, his presence felt in every sudden draft of wind and every creak of a shifting roof. The village of Nayatinkara was holding its breath, and the air was beginning to run out as the realization set in that the monster was not just passing through, but had found a home in their collective fear. The investigation hit one dead end after another. The police searched the homes of known criminals and monitored the pawn shops for any sign of the stolen gold, but the killer was too disciplined, or perhaps too familiar with the ways of the world, to be caught so easily. They looked for patterns in the crimes, trying to predict where he would strike next, but his movements seemed both random and terrifyingly deliberate. He was a shadow among shadows, a man who could blend into a crowd by day and become a nightmare by night. The lack of progress by the authorities only fueled the panic, leading to talk of vigilante groups and further eroding the trust between the people and those sworn to protect them. In the heart of Nayatinkara, the sun would rise each morning to reveal a village that had survived another night, but the light brought no relief. It only brought the grim knowledge that the darkness would eventually return, and with it, the quiet footsteps of the one who waited in the trees. To understand the man who would eventually haunt the borderlands between Kerala and Karnataka, we must travel back to the 15th of December, 1950. In the small village of Karinthalam, nestled within the quiet, emerald folds of Nileswaram, a boy named Muthukutty Chandran was born. The air in this region is often heavy with the scent of damp earth and the distant, rhythmic drumming of the monsoon. It was a place where life moved at a glacial pace, governed by the cycle of the seasons and the demands of the soil. But for young Chandran, the pastoral stillness of his childhood was shattered far too early. When his father passed away, the fragile structure of his family world collapsed. He was forced to abandon his studies, leaving behind the safety of the classroom and the promise of a conventional life. At only 14 years old, he turned his back on the only home he had ever known, stepping into a world of uncertainty. 14 is an age of transition, but for Chandran, it was the year he chose to become a ghost. He drifted away from the familiar hills of Kerala and crossed into the sprawling, unfamiliar landscape of Karnataka. In these early years, he was a shadow among the crowds, a wanderer with no fixed destination or moral compass. To survive, he quickly learned the art of taking what was not his. It began with the smallest of transgressions, petty thefts, the lifting of a few coins from a shop counter, or the quiet removal of an unattended bag. He moved through the busy streets with a growing sense of invisibility, learning how to watch people without being noticed. There is a specific kind of coldness that settles into a person when they realize that most of the world is unsuspecting and easy to exploit. He discovered that a lock on a door was merely a suggestion, and the darkness was a sanctuary. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these formative years was the elaborate mask he wore whenever he returned to his native village. Every so often, Chandran would reappear in Karinthalam, not as a desperate runaway, but as a man of apparent success. He carried himself with a newfound confidence, his pockets filled with the proceeds of his criminal activities in Karnataka. The villagers looked at him and saw a local boy who had made good. They whispered to one another about the industrious young man who had gone away and built a thriving business in the city. He was careful, calculated, and remarkably polite to everyone he met. He would greet the village elders with traditional respect and provide for his mother with a generosity that effectively masked the rot beneath his character. This was his first great deception, the ability to maintain a facade of absolute normalcy while living a life of profound dishonesty. But the mask was never entirely seamless. Beneath the veneer of the successful businessman, a volatile and dangerous temper was brewing, fueled by a growing dependence on alcohol. The money he brought home often vanished into the local taverns. In the quiet, late hours of the night, the facade would often slip away, replaced by a jagged and irrational rage. The most terrifying glimpse of his true nature occurred during a heated argument with his mother over money for liquor. In a fit of uncontrollable fury, he attacked her with a billhook and then struck her on the head with a hammer. She miraculously survived the assault, but the incident was a dark omen for the future. The hammer, usually a tool of construction, had become his chosen instrument of destruction. The petty thief had finally tasted the intoxicating power of absolute violence, and the shadow within him was beginning to take a definitive shape. By the early 1980s, Chandran had fully embraced his dual identity. He was the man from the shadows, a figure who understood the geography of fear. He found a kindred spirit in a man named Thimea. Together, they refined a terrifyingly efficient method of operation. Chandran was meticulous. He did not just strike, he observed. He preferred houses that were isolated, often nestled near highways or the rhythmic clatter of railway tracks. These locations provided both a target and a perfect escape route. He would watch for days, noting the timing of a lamp being extinguished. He was learning how to wait for the moment of absolute silence. The thefts of his youth were no longer enough. The gold was still the objective, but the act of entering a home while its inhabitants slept had become a ritual of dominance. The shadow was now ready to strike. The air in the police headquarters during the late months of 1985 was thick with more than just the monsoon humidity of Kerala. It was heavy with the weight of unanswered questions and the growing shadow of a predator who seemed to vanish into the rain as quickly as he appeared. The investigators sat beneath the slow, rhythmic rotation of ceiling fans, their desks piled high with handwritten reports and missing property lists. They were looking for a ghost, a man who left behind nothing but the cold silence of his victims. But every ghost leaves a trace, and in this case, the trace was not found at the crime scenes, but in the dim, narrow corridors of the local economy. They began to focus their attention on the one thing that had been systematically stripped from every home the intruder touched: the gold. In this region, gold is more than just wealth. It is history, family, and identity. To steal it is to steal a piece of a person's soul, and the police knew that eventually, even the most careful shadow would have to bring those stolen souls into the light of a pawn shop window. The investigation team moved through the bustling streets of Kasaragod and across the border into Mangalore, visiting the small, cramped offices of pawnbrokers and local jewelers. These shops were often tucked away in the corners of busy markets, smelling of old paper, metal polish, and the faint, sweet scent of burning incense. The atmosphere inside was always hushed, a place where people brought their most precious belongings in moments of quiet desperation. The officers didn't look at the displays, they looked at the ledgers. They asked the brokers to produce the heavy, leather-bound registers where every transaction was recorded by hand. They spent hours under flickering tube lights, their fingers tracing the lines of ink, looking for entries that coincided with the dates of the attacks. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process of comparing weights and descriptions: 30 grams of gold, a broken clasp, a specific engraving of a leaf. They were searching for the glimmer of stolen ornaments amidst the thousands of legitimate pledges. One afternoon, in a shop that sat near the edge of the railway tracks, a breakthrough began to crystallize. The investigators' eyes landed on an entry from October 1985. It was a pledge for a heavy gold necklace, known locally as a thali. The weight recorded in the ledger was almost a perfect match for the one stolen from the home of Narasapia Hand. The broker, a man with glasses thick as bottle glass, remembered the transaction because the man who brought it in didn't look like the typical borrower. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. As the police dug deeper into the books of neighboring shops, the names started to repeat. Sometimes it was written as Muthukutty, sometimes as Chandran, and occasionally as Ramachandran. It was a common name, yes, but the handwriting on the receipts, the way the C looped back upon itself, and the shaky pressure of the pen, suggested the same hand was behind every signature. The officers began to recover the physical items. They sat in the back rooms of these shops, spreading out the ornaments on pieces of black velvet. There were bangles with delicate filigree, ear studs shaped like small mangoes, and long, traditional chains that had been passed down through generations. To a stranger, it was just gold. But to the investigators, who carried the descriptions provided by survivors like Indira, these were pieces of a puzzle. They noticed a specific dent on one of the bangles, a repair mark that Indira had described with heartbreaking clarity. As they held the cold metal, they could feel the connection to the violence that had occurred in the dark. This wasn't just a paper trail, it was a map of a killer's movements. Each pawn shop represented a stop on a journey of blood and greed. The sheer volume of the gold being turned into cash was staggering. It suggested a man who was not just stealing to survive, but a man who was building a fortune on the remains of his victims. The paper trail began to point with increasing intensity toward the border of Karnataka. The signatures in the ledgers became more frequent as they moved toward the hills. The police realized that Chandran was using the vast, interconnected network of small towns and villages to hide his tracks, caching in the gold far from the scenes of his crimes to avoid suspicion. He was playing a game of geography, betting that the police in one district wouldn't talk to the brokers in another. But the meticulous nature of the task force was beginning to overcome his luck. They started to build a timeline of his visits. He would strike, wait a few days for the initial panic to subside, and then appear at a shop miles away, presenting himself as a businessman or a traveler in temporary need of funds. The brokers described him as a man of average height, with a gaze that felt hollow, as if he were looking through you rather than at you. By the time the investigation reached the early weeks of 1986, the folder labeled Muthukutty Chandran had grown thick with evidence. They had the names of the shops, the dates of the transactions, and the physical evidence of the stolen gold. Most importantly, they had a destination. The paper trail ended in the lush, coffee-growing regions of Chikmagalur. The man who had been a shadow in the monsoon rain was finally becoming a person of flesh and bone. The investigators could almost see him now, walking the dusty roads with a pocket full of gold and a hammer hidden in his bag. The glimmer of that stolen gold, which he thought would buy him a life of luxury, had instead become a beacon, lighting the way for the law to follow. The net was no longer being cast wide. It was closing in, tightening around a single point on the map where the man known as the Ripper thought he was safe. The silence was about to end. The folder labeled Muthukutty Chandran had grown thick with evidence. Through the closing weeks of 1985 and into the dawn of 1986, the investigators had lived within a cycle of grim discoveries and silent vigils. The documents within that file told a story of a man who moved like a ghost across the borders of Kerala and Karnataka, leaving behind a trail of shattered homes and broken lives. But on this particular morning, the focus of the investigation shifted away from the dusty station offices and toward the humid, shimmering banks of the river. The sunlight of early January was already beginning to bake the red earth, casting long, lean shadows through the dense coconut groves that lined the water. The local police team, dressed in their stiff, sun-bleached uniforms, stood at the edge of the bank where the current slowed into a series of muddy, stagnant pools. There was a heavy, expectant silence in the air, broken only by the rhythmic lap of water against the tangled roots of the mangroves. The search was born from a lead that had surfaced during a late-night interrogation. A whisper about a discarded weight thrown into the depths where the river met the bend. For the officers on the ground, This was not a task of sudden drama, but one of agonizingly slow, methodical labor. They moved in a line, their boots sinking deep into the gray silt of the riverbank. Each step was a struggle against the suction of the mud, a physical reminder of the heavy burden this case had placed upon the community. They were looking for something specific, something heavy enough to sink, but significant enough to bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. The lead investigator watched from the higher ground, his eyes shielded by a worn cap, as the men used long wooden poles to probe the soft bottom of the riverbed. Every clink against a submerged stone or a piece of buried wood caused the entire line to pause, their breaths held in the stagnant heat of the morning. Hours passed with the slow, grinding pace of a dream. The forensic team had cordoned off a wide stretch of the bank, their white tape fluttering weakly in the occasional humid breeze. They were using a manual sifting process, lifting buckets of the river muck and spreading it thin over wire mesh screens. It was a sensory ordeal. The smell of decaying vegetation and ancient river silt filled their lungs, a sharp contrast to the clinical environment of the station. They searched for the glint of gold, perhaps a small earring or a fragment of a necklace that might have been dropped in haste. But more importantly, they searched for the iron. They searched for the tool that had become the hallmark of the man they now called the Ripper. The methodical scraping of the mesh was the only sound for a long time, a gritty, repetitive noise that seemed to echo the tireless search for justice that had now consumed months of their lives. By midday, the heat had reached a punishing intensity. The investigators were drenched in sweat, their movements becoming slower, more deliberate. It was then that a younger officer, stationed near a cluster of half-submerged rocks, called out with a voice that was barely more than a strained rasp. He had felt something solid, something with a weight that did not match the surrounding stones. The team converged slowly, careful not to disturb the sediment and cloud the water further. With a pair of long iron tongs, they reached into the dark, murky depths. The water rippled and broke as a shape began to emerge from the river's grasp. It was caked in layers of black mud and algae, a shapeless mass that seemed at first to be nothing more than industrial waste. But as the officer gently rinsed the object with a bucket of clear water, the true nature of the find began to reveal itself to the silent circle of watchers. It was a heavy, short-handled iron hammer. The metal head was pitted with rust from its time beneath the water, but the weight of it was unmistakable. As the sun hit the wet iron, it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. This was the physical embodiment of the violence that had terrorized the railway lines and the highway homes. The forensic lead stepped forward, his movements practiced and reverent, as he placed the weapon onto a clean white sheet. Even beneath the rust and the river grime, they could see the blunt force it was capable of delivering. It was a simple tool, one found in 1,000 workshops across the state, yet in the hands of Muthukutty Chandran, it had become an instrument of absolute finality. The team stood in a profound silence, the gravity of the discovery settling over them like the heavy afternoon mist. They were no longer just chasing a shadow, they were holding the shadow's edge. The discovery did not end the day's work. In fact, it only intensified the scrutiny. For the next several hours, the forensic team worked to document every inch of the find. They measured the distance from the bank, the depth of the silt, and the angle at which the hammer had been resting. Every detail was recorded in longhand across the pages of the ledger, the ink drying slowly in the humid air. They knew that in a court of law, the provenance of this iron would be as important as the iron itself. As the shadows of the coconut palms began to stretch across the river once more, the team began the process of packing their equipment. The hammer was sealed in a reinforced evidence container, a small, dark box that seemed far too light for the secrets it held. The investigation was moving forward, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a terrifying precision. The river had given up one of its secrets, and the path to Chickmagaller was becoming clearer with every passing hour. The transition from the cold, clinical world of forensics to the raw, trembling reality of human memory is often where a case truly begins to breathe. While the investigators in the mid-1980s meticulously documented every blood spatter and every indentation left by a heavy tool, the local communities were paralyzed by a fear that no laboratory could quantify. The shadows along the railway tracks of Kerala and the dusty stretches of the Karnataka border were no longer just parts of the landscape. They were perceived as hiding places for a monster. For months, the police had been chasing a ghost, a predator who struck with terrifying speed and vanished before the morning light could reveal his path. But ghosts do not leave behind descriptions, and until this moment, the authorities had little more than a pattern of brutality. That changed when a single voice emerged from the darkness, providing the first flicker of light in an otherwise pitch-black investigation. Imagine a humid night in 1985. The air is thick, clinging to the skin like a damp shroud, and the only sound is the rhythmic, distant clatter of a train moving along the iron rails. Near a small, unsecured house tucked away from the main road, a man we will call Balin was making his way home. He was a laborer, accustomed to the long walk in the dark, but that night, the silence felt different. It was heavy, weighted with an unspoken threat. As he neared a bend in the path where the trees arched overhead like skeletal fingers, Balin caught the scent of something metallic, not the smell of the tracks, but something sharper. He slowed his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs in a syncopated rhythm with his footsteps. It was then that he saw him. Standing just at the edge of the tall grass, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive banyan tree, was a figure that seemed to have been birthed by the night itself. The figure did not move at first. He stood perfectly still, his silhouette framed by the faint, silver glow of a waning moon. Balin froze, his breath hitching in his throat. In the dim light, he could see that the man was of average height, but possessed a stocky, powerful build. He wore simple, dark clothing that allowed him to blend effortlessly into the undergrowth. But it was what the man held in his hand that caused Balin's blood to run cold. It was a heavy object, wrapped partially in a ragged cloth, yet the unmistakable shape of a hammer's head peeked through. The weight of it seemed to pull at the man's shoulder, a silent testament to its lethal potential. For several long, agonizing seconds, the two men stood in a stalemate of observation. The predator was watching the prey, calculating the risk, while the witness struggled to remain invisible despite being in plain sight. Then the man spoke. It wasn't a shout or a threat, but a low, guttural murmur that drifted through the tall grass like a cold breeze. The words were indistinguishable, a voice from the dark that sounded more like a growl than human speech. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. Panic finally overcame Balin's paralysis. He didn't run immediately. Instead, he backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the figure. He watched as the man adjusted his grip on the hammer, the knuckles of his hand turning white even in the gloom. The stranger took one step forward, his feet making almost no sound on the dry earth, and Balin knew that if he stayed a moment longer, he would become another nameless statistic in the growing list of victims. He turned and bolted, his feet thundering against the ground, the sound of his own heavy breathing masking any pursuit that might have followed. When Balin finally reached the safety of a well-lit junction, he was trembling so violently he could hardly speak. But the details he provided to the local constabulary were more vivid than any evidence gathered so far. He described a man with intense, piercing eyes that seemed to reflect no light, a face that was weathered and unremarkable, yet possessed an aura of terrifying calm. This was the first time the authorities had a physical description to attach to the name Muthukutty Chandran, though at that stage, they still only knew him as the Ripper. Balin spoke of the way the man moved, with the deliberate grace of a hunter who knew the terrain better than the people who lived there. He described the hammer not just as a tool, but as an extension of the man's own arm. This testimony was a breakthrough. It shifted the investigation from a search for a phantom to a manhunt for a man of flesh and bone, a man who walked the same paths as his victims. The police listened with growing unease as Balin recounted the encounter. They realized that the killer was not just targeting the vulnerable. He was observing them, lingering in the shadows of their lives before deciding when to strike. The description of the stocky man with the hammer began to circulate through the villages, turning every stranger into a suspect and every shadow into a potential hiding place. This voice from the dark had given the predator a face, and for Muthukutty Chandran, the world was beginning to shrink. The first 3 months of 1986 would see the investigation move with a newfound urgency, driven by the chilling realization that the killer was likely watching them even as they searched for him. The narrow escape of one man had provided the key to unlocking a door that had been slammed shut by a year of terror, leading the way toward the eventual confrontation in the quiet town of Chikmagalur. The humid air of northern Kerala has a way of clinging to the skin, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation. In the mid-1980s, the village of Karinthalam was a place where the passage of time was measured by the monsoon cycles rather than the ticking of a clock. To the people living there, Muthukutty Chandran was not a specter of death, but a local boy who had finally found his footing in the world. When he returned to the village after long stretches of absence, he did not arrive with the disheveled appearance of a predator. Instead, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had made something of himself in the neighboring state of Karnataka. He walked the narrow paths of his childhood home with a measured gait, nodding to the elders who sat on their verandas. To them, he was simply Chandran, the son who had survived the early death of his father and gone out into the wider world to seek a fortune that the small paddies of Kerala could not provide. In the local tea shops, where the sound of pouring liquid creates a rhythmic percussion against the morning chatter, Chandran was a familiar but unremarkable presence. He would sit on the wooden benches, his fingers wrapped around a hot glass of ginger tea, listening to the men discuss the price of pepper or the latest political shifts in the district. He was 35 years old during this period, a man in his prime with dark, observant eyes and a build hardened by labor. He never dominated the conversation. He was a listener, a trait that many mistook for humility or shyness. Neighbors later recalled that he was always polite, offering soft-spoken greetings as he passed by. There was nothing in his smile that suggested a fracture in his soul. He possessed what many call the mask of normalcy, a social camouflage so thick that it resisted the intuition of those who had known him since he was 14 years old. He was a ghost hiding in plain sight, blending into the tapestry of village life as seamlessly as the shadows that lengthened under the banyan trees at dusk. The money he brought back from his supposed business ventures in Karnataka was perhaps the most effective part of his disguise. In a community where cash was often scarce, Chandran's newfound prosperity was viewed with a mixture of pride and envy, but never suspicion. He was generous with his funds, contributing to local needs and ensuring his family was well cared for. This financial success served as a physical proof of his respectability. People assumed he was involved in trade or labor contracting across the border. They never imagined that the notes in his pocket were the remnants of stolen lives, or that the jewelry he occasionally sold had been violently taken from those who slept soundly in their beds. He would tell stories of the bustling markets in Chikmagalur, describing the mountain air and the hard work of the coffee plantations. These stories were grounded enough in reality to be believable, providing a logical framework for his long absences and his sudden influx of wealth. He was building a legend of the self-made man, while simultaneously destroying the lives of others. His daily routine when he was away from home was equally calculated. Chandran moved with the precision of a predator who understood the terrain of the working class. He often took on odd jobs as a laborer or a stone cutter, roles that allowed him to move through various towns without attracting a second glance. A man with a hammer or a pickaxe in his hand is a common sight in the developing landscape of 1980s India. By day, he was just another face in the crowd of workers, sweating under the sun, earning a meager wage that supplemented his true income. He observed the houses near the railway tracks and the national highways, noting which ones had unsecured windows or doors that didn't quite latch. He watched the movements of the residents, identifying the homes where only women or the elderly remained at night. This observational phase was done with such mundane regularity that it looked like nothing more than a tired worker resting his eyes. He was gathering intelligence under the guise of exhaustion, mapping out the geography of his next strike, while the world around him went about its business. The chilling nature of his normalcy was most apparent in his ability to switch between two entirely different worlds. He could spend an evening at a local festival, surrounded by the smell of jasmine and the sound of temple drums, and then disappear into the darkness to commit a crime of unthinkable brutality. There was no transition period, no visible sign of a brewing storm within him. After committing a murder, he would often simply return to his rented room or move to the next town, resuming his identity as a quiet laborer. He would wash the blood from his hands and the dust from his clothes, appearing at a roadside eatery the next morning to eat a simple meal of rice and lentils. He did not manifest the frantic energy of a madman. His pulse remained steady as he sat among families and travelers, his heavy tool bag resting at his feet. Inside that bag lay the instruments of his violence, yet to the casual observer, it held only the tools of a hard-working man. This duality allowed him to evade capture for a period that spanned 14 murders over the course of barely 2 years. Even as the police began to connect the dots of the various killings across the borders of Kerala and Karnataka, the image of the killer remained elusive because he did not fit the profile of a monster. He was not an outcast. He was not a hermit. He was a neighbor, a son, and a customer at the local markets. This ability to blend into the social fabric meant that even when descriptions began to circulate, many who knew him dismissed the possibility that their polite, successful friend could be the one responsible. They looked for a villain in the shadows, not realizing that the shadow was sitting right next to them at the tea stall. It was only when the weight of evidence became undeniable that the mask began to crack. On the 26th of February, 1986, the charade finally ended in the town of Chikmagalur. The man who everyone thought was a businessman was revealed to be a serial killer, leaving a trail of 14 victims in his wake. The shock that rippled through Karinthalam was profound. They had looked into his eyes for years and seen only a reflection of their own ordinary lives, never suspecting the darkness that lay just beneath the surface. The air in the borderlands during the final days of February, 1986, was thick with a heavy, unspoken dread. For months, the shadows had seemed longer as whispers of the one they called the Ripper drifted through the streets like a cold fog. The people lived in a state of quiet siege, bolting their doors against a predator who struck with silent, brutal efficiency. But while the public retreated, a hidden heart was beating in the darkness, the pulse of a special anti-dacoity squad formed by the police in Mangaluru. These men had sworn to end the reign of Muthukutty Chandran, and they were finally closing the distance between the hunter and the hunted. The search had led the task force into the rugged, mist-shrouded terrain of Chikmagalur, a region famous for its sprawling coffee estates and winding roads. Here, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and ripening berries. The squad moved with calculated stealth, no longer just reacting to crimes, but actively hunting their quarry. Their information consisted of fragments of a nightmare, a man who preferred the isolation of the night and the vulnerability of the sleeping. They knew he was somewhere in this town, hiding in plain sight. The officers, including determined men like Narayana Maniyani, remained vigilant, knowing that the man they sought was as elusive as a ghost. Under the cover of the indigo hours, the officers took their positions. Dressed in plain clothes, they blended into the rough-hewn texture of the urban landscape. Some sat in quiet corners of tea stalls, while others stood motionless in the shadows, their eyes scanning every figure that emerged from the gloom. The tension was a physical weight, a coiled spring waiting for the slightest movement to release. They had heard reports of his last brutal act in Parasynicadav just 2 weeks prior, and the urgency felt like a fire in their chests. Every sound, the rustle of a leaf or the distant bark of a dog, was a potential signal that the moment of confrontation was near. On the afternoon of February 26, the atmosphere shifted. A tip-off directed the squad to a specific location where a suspicious man had been spotted. The officers moved with practiced fluidity, closing the distance without drawing attention. Through the haze of the light, they saw him, a man of slight build, his clothes worn and dusty, looking like a common laborer. But they noticed the way he moved, a slow, deliberate gait that lacked the fatigue of a working man. He carried a small bundle, and there was a predatory alertness in his eyes that did not match his unassuming frame. This was the man who had left a trail of blood across 2 states, now standing within reach. The signal to move was nearly silent, a mere nod from the lead officer. From 3 different directions, the members of the task force began to converge. The crunch of gravel under their boots seemed deafening in the sudden stillness of the encounter. Muthukutty Chandran sensed the change before he saw his pursuers. He stopped, his head tilting like an animal caught in the scent of a hunter. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing down to the space between the law and the lawless. He looked for an escape toward the narrow passages, but the circle was already complete. The weight of his crimes seemed to ground him as the officers stepped forward from the shadows. When the realization struck, he did not surrender quietly. As the officers lunged, he turned to run, but was met with the firm, unyielding grip of the law. There was a brief, frantic struggle, a scramble in the dirt where the reality of his physical presence collided with the terrifying legend he had created. He was smaller than many had imagined, his strength born of a desperate survivalism. But against the combined force of the squad, he was quickly subdued. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the final punctuation mark on a chapter of terror that had spanned 14 lives. As they pulled him to his feet, the man known as the Ripper was finally, irrevocably contained. In the quiet aftermath, the officers examined the bundle he had been carrying. Inside, they found the tools of his grim trade, a hammer and blood-stained clothes that linked him directly to his victims. The discovery sent a chill through the investigators. As they led him toward the waiting vehicle, news of the capture began to spread like a wildfire through the hills. The sense of relief that swept through the region was profound, a collective exhale from a population that had been holding its breath for far too long. The midnight pursuit had ended. As the vehicle pulled away, the coming darkness held no fear. The long night of the Ripper was over, and the path to justice had finally begun. The interrogation room was a confined space, a small concrete box that seemed to shrink as the hours ticked by. A single window, high up and barred, allowed a thin, dusty beam of moonlight to cut through the gloom, illuminating the swirling smoke from a detective's cigarette. Muthukutty Chandran sat in the center of this world, his hands resting heavily on a scarred wooden table. Across from him, the investigators did not rush. They moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, laying out the items recovered from his bundle one by one. The hammer, heavy and cold, was placed directly under the light. Its iron head was stained with the dark, rusted evidence of his journey. Beside it lay the blood-flecked clothes, stiffened by the sun and salt air of the coast. For a long time, Chandran only stared at the tools, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock that was finally running down. The air felt heavy, saturated with the unsaid truths of a dozen missing souls. For the first several hours, he was a statue of defiance. He maintained a facade of innocence, his voice a low, steady drone as he claimed he was merely a traveler, a man of simple means caught in a web of misfortune. But the detectives were patient. They began to recount the details of the crime scenes, describing the specific, brutal geometry of the wounds left by a hammer just like the one on the table. They spoke of the quiet villages near the railway tracks where families had once felt safe behind wooden doors. As the night deepened into the early hours of the morning, the weight of the evidence began to press against his resolve. The walls of his denial started to show hairline fractures. It was the mention of a small village in the Kasargod district that finally broke the dam. His eyes flickered, reflecting the harsh bulb above, and he leaned forward. The first crack in his story was small, a correction of a minor detail, but it was the beginning of a flood that would take hours to fully recede. He began at the beginning, his voice losing its rough edge and taking on a chilling, matter-of-fact tone. He spoke of September 10th, 1985. This was the day the transition occurred, the moment he moved from petty thefts to something far darker. He confessed to the murder of a woman named Ramani, a resident of Kasargod who lived near the quiet area of Kemnad. He described the approach, the way the shadows of the evening had provided him cover as he neared her home. There was no passion in his voice as he recounted the strike, only a cold, mechanical precision. It was the first of 14 lives he would admit to taking over the span of just a few months. As he spoke, the officers realized they were not just listening to a confession, but to a chronological map of a nightmare that had gripped the border regions of Kerala and Karnataka for nearly a year. The narrative moved north to Manjaswaram, where the violence had escalated with terrifying speed. Chandran detailed how, only a month after his first killing, he had entered a home and ended the lives of 3 family members in a single night. He spoke of using a pickaxe during this particular attack, describing the weight of the tool and the way the moonlight hit the metal. The detectives watched him, noted how he seemed to remember the layout of every house, the position of every sleeping victim. He targeted the vulnerable, those living in unsecured homes near the highway or the iron veins of the railway lines. These were places where a man could vanish into the darkness of the tracks long before the sun rose to reveal his handiwork. The timeline was relentless. 1985 was drawing to a close, but his path of blood was only halfway through its grim arc. The most harrowing part of the confession involved the temple at Balangadi in South Karnataka. Chandran described how he had arrived there appearing as a man in search of work, a humble traveler seeking shelter. He earned the trust of the 75-year-old priest, Narasapia Hand. The priest, a man of peace, had allowed Chandran to stay within the temple precincts, offering him food and a place to rest. Chandran's voice remained flat as he explained how he waited until the temple was silent, until the last of the devotees had returned to their homes and the incense smoke had faded into the night air. He bludgeoned the elderly priest and a temple helper named Viswanathan, his motive a simple, hollow desire for the small treasures kept within the sacred walls. To hear him speak of such betrayal was to listen to a man who had completely severed his connection to the human heart, viewing his victims as obstacles rather than people. As the sun began to rise outside the station on February 26, 1986, the full scope of his crimes was finally laid bare. 14 murders were systematically linked to his name through his own words and the evidence they had gathered. The interrogation had provided the missing pieces to over a dozen cold cases that had haunted local families for months. Cases that had been whispers of fear in village squares were now brought into the harsh light of the law. He spoke of his accomplice for some of the earlier robberies, a man named Thimia. But as the confession neared its end, it was clear that the core of the violence belonged to Chandran alone. The geography of his terror spanned the border districts of 2 states, turning the peaceful landscape into a hunting ground. The weight of his words felt like lead in the room, a record of a year defined by the heavy, rhythmic strikes of a hammer in the dark. The confession finally tapered off as the morning light filled the interrogation room, revealing the exhaustion on the faces of the men who had listened. For the families in the border villages, the news of his words brought a complex, painful form of closure. The mystery of their lost loved ones was solved, replaced by the grim reality of a man who had walked among them with a hammer hidden in a bundle of cloth. Muthukutty Chandran, the man the newspapers would call a ripper despite his own hatred for the title, had finished his story. He would eventually be moved to a cell in the Kannur Central Jail, where the long process of justice would begin, leading toward a quiet morning in July of 1991. But for now, in the silence of the station, the truth had been unveiled. The shadows that had stretched across the region for so long were finally starting to retreat, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of the lives he had stolen and the trail he had left in the dust. The air in the Kasargod Sessions Court was thick with more than just the humid breath of the Arabian Sea. It was a stillness that felt heavy, like the weight of a storm about to break. Imagine the room if you can. The slow, rhythmic creak of the overhead ceiling fans, cutting through the stagnant heat with a steady, hypnotic pulse. The wooden benches, polished by decades of nervous movement, and the passage of countless souls, were filled with people whose faces held a mixture of lingering fear and a desperate need for closure. In the center of it all sat the man the world now called the Ripper, though to the records of the court, he was simply Muthukutty Chandran. He remained a figure of chilling composure, a man who had navigated the borderlands of Kerala and Karnataka, leaving a trail of sorrow that the state would not soon forget. The prosecution laid out the evidence with a methodical, almost surgical precision that seemed to slow down time itself. They spoke of the pickaxe, a heavy tool of labor that had been twisted into an instrument of ultimate darkness. They described the quiet homes near the railway tracks and the national highways, places where families once slept with their windows open to catch the night breeze before the terror began. The court heard the harrowing testimony of Indira, a survivor whose voice carried the weight of the 14 souls who could no longer speak for themselves. Each word she uttered seemed to pull the walls of the courtroom closer, reminding everyone of the nights between 1985 and 1986, when the very idea of home had felt fragile and thin. The descriptions of the hammer blows and the calculated robberies painted a picture of a man who moved with a terrifying lack of empathy, striking when the world was most vulnerable. When the judge finally rose to deliver the verdict in 1987, a profound silence descended upon the assembly. It was the kind of silence that rings in the ears, the sound of 1,000 held breaths, and a sudden, shared recognition of finality. The words rarest of rare were spoken with a gravity that seemed to physically press down upon the room, a heavy blanket of legal and moral judgment. This was not a sentence given lightly. It was a recognition of a level of brutality that had shocked the collective conscience of a peaceful society. The death penalty was announced, and for a moment, the rhythmic whirring of the fans was the only sound to be heard in the chamber. Muthukutty Chandran stood there, his expression a mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil that might have been hidden beneath his skin. The gavel finally fell, a sharp, singular strike that signaled the beginning of the end for the man who had terrorized the hills and the valleys of northern Kerala. The years that followed were spent within the gray, imposing walls of the Kannur Central Jail, where the days stretched into a long, monotonous wait. From 1987 until 1991, the legal machinery turned slowly, grinding through appeals to the High Court and eventually the Supreme Court of India. In the isolation of his cell, the man who had once been a shadow in the night was now a prisoner of the steady, unblinking daylight. Reports from those years suggest a man who grew increasingly quiet, perhaps finally feeling the immense weight of the 14 lives he had extinguished for the sake of mere ornaments and coins. Outside, the villages began to heal, though the habits of the Ripper years remained deeply etched in the culture. Doors were double-bolted, and the arrival of dusk brought a new kind of vigilance that was passed down through stories. The fear had entered the soil of the land, a lingering shadow that only time and the finality of justice could begin to truly dissipate. The dawn of July 6th, 1991, arrived with a soft, gray light over the coastal city of Canner. Inside the central jail, the atmosphere was somber and absolute, a space where time seemed to stand still. It is said that in his final hours, the man who had shown so little mercy requested a simple comfort, the cool, sweet water of a tender coconut. He drank it slowly, savoring the taste of the earth one last time before the long, silent walk to the gallows. There was no defiance left in his posture, only a strange, hollow readiness for the end. As the sun began to climb above the horizon, the sentence was carried out with a quiet efficiency. It was the last time the state of Kerala would perform such an act, making this moment not just the end of a single man's life, but a significant marker in the legal and social history of the region. The echo of the gavel had finally reached its final destination. With the execution of Muthukutty Chandran, a chapter of profound darkness was formally closed, leaving behind a legacy of caution and a reformed sense of public safety. The story of the Ripper remains a cautionary whisper in the tall grass of the borderlands, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. But for you, listener, that darkness is now far away, a mere memory of a story told in the quiet hours. The history has been shared, the facts have been laid to rest, and the shadows have retreated back into the books from which they came. The air around you is calm, the night is still, and there is nothing left to fear in the soft glow of your surroundings. The weight of the story has lifted, leaving only the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath as it guides you toward rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.